Paul's dealing with. And it has to do with what's going on inside the Corinthian church. There are certain things that are somewhat out of balance, and Paul is trying to bring those back into balance. He's dealing with cultural issues and also procedural issues. And he's also going to deal with one of the areas that is most really somewhat startling, and that is the Lord's Supper itself. And how serious the misuse of the Lord's Supper truly can be. And he's going to deal with that. And that part we may get to maybe tonight, but if not tonight, maybe next week. So, verse 1 of chapter 11 simply is, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. That seems to be a verse that goes with the previous chapter better than the one we're getting ready to move into. As I mentioned before on other occasions, the chapter and verse divisions that you see in your Bible, those were added much later. Paul's letter did not have chapter 11. It was just a extended, probably a scroll that it was written, and later it was divided up. And it was divided up for convenience. You might be remembering when Jesus went to Nazareth, when kind of his inaugural sermon there at least, they brought him the scroll of Isaiah, and he found the place where it says. Not a chapter, but the place where it said. And so that's just something for us to keep in mind. And that's why, sometimes the chapter and verse divisions can be a bit misleading, or it may, if we just look at chapters only, we can kind of miss the connection with what came previously. So anyway, Paul was given a very long autobiographical, really, statements about how he did ministry, piggybacking on what he had already previously said, about to be concerned about the weaker brother, to be concerned about other believers. Not simply live your life in a cavalier manner, but you would do so with other people in mind. Because your life impacts the lives of other people. It just does. And we forget that. And in our culture, we have a tendency to forget that. Who are you? Who are you to say anything to me? That's kind of the attitude that so many in the United States particularly have. We have this, it was Carl Truman wrote a book some time ago, and in that book he maintains about this autonomous self that is permeating in our culture, and it's absolutely destructive. That's why people today live by their feelings. One of the worst things you can do is hurt someone's feelings. If he wants to be a she and call themselves, if you don't acknowledge that, you would hurt their feelings. And they have the autonomous self is the idea I can be whatever I want to be, regardless of reality, and you've got to accept it. That's kind of our culture. And Paul, you can't do that in Christianity. If you're following Christ, you cannot live as in the autonomous self. Matter of fact, you need to pick up your cross, as Luke says, daily, and follow after Jesus. And a man dying on the cross isn't concerned about the autonomous self. It's just not what's on his mind. And that gives us some clues to what Jesus is following him really is like. So let's look in verse 2. Now I praise you, brothers, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. The idea of traditions here is his teaching, what he taught them. And he wanted to praise them on that behalf. Now, maybe they were doing that to some degree, but they were doing a lot of other things too. And Paul's going to get into the meat of that in just a moment. But, and by the way, the word "but" is a very important word. It's like the word, there's several key words that you'll come across that help you interpret the Bible, understand it. One is the word "therefore." That's a conclusion kind of thing. What comes before that word, therefore, this is how you respond to it. And the word but also. The word but sets up a contrast. Just talking about praising them, but he's got something else on his mind. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. And the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Now, we're going to get lost in his language if we're not careful. Because the word head is somewhat problematic for us to understand. He says, every man praying, verse 4, or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. Okay, now we need to park for a minute. What does he mean by head? Does he mean your head? Maybe. Some would suggest that's what he's got in mind. Not. I don't think exactly that's what he's got in mind. He's talking about. Well, let's just back up and look at it. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. Who's the head of every man? Christ. Got it. The head of every woman is man. You got it? You see how the word head is being used here? And the head of Christ is God. So what is basically being mentioned here is talking about authority. And it's talking about the creation order. Now, is Christ, how do we understand biblical theology in reference to the Lord Jesus? Is he less than God? No. The answer is no. The old confession, he is the second person of the triune God. He's co-eternal. Everything's co. What God the Father is, the Son is, and the Spirit is. And then when we move here, though, he is talking about being willingly subordinate. Every man is to be subordinate to Christ. Now he's talking about men in the church. And he even goes as far as saying that a man is not to cover his head. Now we'll talk about that for just a moment. Now cover his head, what is he talking about? I'm trying to give you a clue here. Covering his head. Okay? So the word head is being used in two senses here. Now, and he follows that up. Now, the head of the woman is the man. Most unquestionably is referring to her husband. Not simply any particular or any man at all, but her husband. Now, the idea being communicated here is not worth, value, or importance, or anything like that. It is simply a reflection back to creation order. And he's going to appeal to creation order in just a few moments. So as we begin unpacking this, notice, okay, and then he begins talking about, in verse 4, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Okay, who is he dishonoring? Christ. Okay? All right. Then followed up that, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Who?
Husband.
Her husband. Undoubtedly her husband. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. And there's some cultural aspects to this as well. Now, Paul is not laying down a statement that is universal for all times, but he is speaking about some very important cultural things. Remember to whom he's writing. Who is he writing to? Corinth. What goes on in Corinth? Well, there's a lot that goes on in Corinth, a lot that went on in Corinth. There were apparently in the temples there, especially the one of Aphrodite, there would be what would be called priests and priestesses. And some of the dynamics there, at least it seems suggested there, you had several things going on. And most of these priests and priestesses basically performed the function of being a prostitute or prostitution. Not being paid per se, but participating in the worship of the goddess of sex. There. So what was going on, there were women that were like women. There were women that seemed to be more like men, with heads shaven, those kind of things. And then there were men that were more like women, even dressing as such. You have a lot of bizarre stuff going on there, in other words, in the ancient world. We think most of this stuff is new. It's not. This stuff has been around for forever, almost. Well, not forever, but for a long, long time. Now, so Paul is going to appeal to the Corinthian congregation. He's going to appeal to them about creation order. Now, there's probably a couple incidental things that may be kind of lodged in your mind. He talks about two practices: praying and prophesying. Now, praying we pretty well understand, right? The prophesying part is a little bit difficult for us because we approach that word with already in our minds a definition of what we're talking about. When I say prophesying, what do you hear? Preaching? Okay. Forthtelling? Okay. Or foretelling. A lot of it depends on the context. Now, in some of our discussions today, even across Christianity, but even within Southern Baptist, is how we understand these. Paul does mention that women praying, but also prophesying. So we wonder what actually is Paul's meaning there. Well, there's going to be a lot of discussion because we do not have a really exhaustive knowledge of the Corinthian church. We just pick up on Paul's trying to correct them. One interpretation has to do with the idea, it has to do with forthtelling, not predicting the future, in that sense prophesying about what's going to happen, but actually we would call it sharing Christ with people. Obviously, the early church, whether they were men or women, both were doing that. Paul later makes it quite clear that the pastorate, the bishop, the episkopos, is to be a person, it is a man qualified by Scripture. He does not leave the door open for women occupying that role. Just doesn't. But it doesn't mean that women don't have a vital role. So Paul is being equally here by using the word praying and prophesying. Okay? Now, there's other possible nuances of trying to understand that word, but I wanted just to deal with it just for a few moments as we move on. For if a woman is not covered, verse 6, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. The thing of it is, is the relationships within the church need to mirror God's design. And that's the problem. You see, the ancient world did not have prohibitions against women having very prominent roles in religious life, not the pagan religious life. There could be As a matter of fact, there were these oracles, is what they're called, in the ancient world. I think there was one not far from Philippi that was an oracle that had a python spirit. That's what they called it. And usually, what it was, or the person who occupied that, would be about a 10-year-old girl. Maybe, and when she would age out, when she hit her teens, they would find another oracle. And what this girl would do is people from all over would come to get predictions from her because she was inhabited by a python spirit. That's what it's called, python spirit. And it was a spirit that would tell people would come and say, I'm going to enter into this business deal. Is this what I should do? And the girl would speak, sometimes with almost sounding like a different voice, maybe even a masculine sounding voice, and would tell the person that was inquiring what he should do. Governmental officials would come and ask about decisions that they needed to make, and they would ask this girl, inhabited by the spirit. That was not unusual. And in the ancient world, it was no problem for there to be goddesses that were worshipped. Right alongside masculine, like Baal and Asherah. There would be, you know, in the Greek world, Diana, Artemis in the Greeks, Diana in the Roman Empire. Those were regularly understood and sought after. So there wasn't this disparity. Even if you go to the Old Testament, you may miss this. And it's even mentioned a time or two about the Queen of Heaven. The Queen of Heaven would be the mother of the God that is being worshipped. And it was even mirrored, as a matter of fact, now I'll get in trouble for this probably, but the veneration of Mary is very close to the Queen of Heaven. It really is. As a matter of fact, it almost mirrors that whole concept, that of the Queen of Heaven. And that was a pagan practice, and it was adopted sometimes by the Jews at different periods of history, where they would worship the Queen of Heaven. Okay? Well, anyway, back to this. Now he's going to get, and it's really helpful that we pay attention to this, especially since we live in an age where there's these two fundamentally different understandings of the relationship between men and women, husbands and wives, and the roles within the church. That has to do with what's called, the fancy word, egalitarian. Egalitarian means no difference. And the other is complementarian. I think that's right. Where the sexes, which is two, by the way, they complement each other. Okay? It's a shame I have to say that. I really didn't need to say that here to you all, but, you know, that they complement each other. One is biblical, one is not. But the one that is not is almost winning today. Okay? And let's go on. Verse 7. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image of and the glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. Now he's getting very theological. And I really appreciate the Apostle Paul in that respect. He grounds what he's saying in God's previous revelation. All right? He does that. When it comes to the roles of men and women in the church, Paul will ground what he's saying by alluding to what the revelation of God already reveals. So, what does he mean? What does it mean that the man is the glory of God?
Is verse 7?
Yes. What does he mean?
The new living
creation.
It goes all the way back to the creation of Adam. Or Adam, the man. Who did God create first? Adam, the man. So he was created in the image of God, but so are women. Because chapter 1, verse 26 and 27 affirms that. So he's not suggesting that women are not. But who is created second? And how was she created? From the man. Now that is simply referred to as creation order. It is not putting a value on one more than the other. It is simply talking about the order in which God did this. And when you look at when God gave Adam the task of naming all the animals, He did. He was naming them, and it was almost. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into it when I say this or not. Adam, he's seeing all these animals come to him, or he goes to them, whatever, however he did it. He was naming them, and it was affirming something. None of these are like me. None of these are. So he realized that he is alone. First thing is said that is not good. It is not good for man to be alone. So I will make a helper suitable for him. In one sense, it is a completer. What Adam was lacking, Eve brought into the relationship. And what Eve was lacking, Adam brought into the relationship. And folks, if you don't understand this, I don't. There's no help for you. Men and women are different more than just simply biologically. You just need to know that. And so I have a little parable I sometimes use with couples when I'm talking to them before they get married, because it's helpful. And I've told this before, and it's great. A couple have been dating for 6 months, and they're coming home from after watching a movie. He is taking her to her house, and as they're driving along, they kind of had just a time of it got quiet, and the young lady speaks out and said, "Do you realize today is we've been dating for 6 months?" And then in her mind, she's beginning to really race with thoughts. He's going to think that I'm trying to pressure him. He's going to think I'm expecting more from him. She's going through all these scenarios. And he sits there and he's quiet. Doesn't say a thing. And she is just running through all of these scenarios about what's happening, what she's done. And and he's sitting there thinking, said, 6 months. It's been 6 months since I've changed the oil in my car. That is not an exaggeration. A woman will sometimes, or a wife will ask her husband, "What are you thinking?" He's not. Stop asking. And the difference is, I know these are generally things, but that's the beauty of God creating male and female, because one completes the other. Adrian Rogers was fond of saying this, that a man is infinitely better than a woman in being a man. And a woman is infinitely better than a man in being a woman. There's no, we shouldn't get hung up on those kind of things. Our culture is just very confused. And by the way, that is exactly what Satan wants. That's exactly what he did in the garden. Who took the lead in the garden? Eve did. She took the lead. Should she have done that? She should not have. But Adam allowed it. So you have it. And at this stage, they're both still innocent. Well, Eve isn't. She's already eaten. But Adam's getting ready to. Okay? Now, so you kind of see. But anyway, Paul grounds what he's getting ready to say in that understanding. He goes further. For man is not from woman, but woman's from man. What's he talking about? He's talking about Eve coming from Adam's side. Okay? God taking a rib and fashioning a woman. Different than Adam, but the same species as Adam. if they use that kind of term. For the man was created, nor was man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. So you know exactly where he's grounding his understanding. And by the way, if you dismiss or anyone dismisses the legitimacy and the historicity of Genesis, you got a problem. You got a real problem. Because you cannot, you don't have anything to ground this in. If you reject Genesis as being, or the first 11 chapters. For this reason, the woman ought to have, now, editors, translators of whatever translation you're using, they're going to add words for clarity. Okay, that's just what they do. And we need that. It's helpful sometimes to have a translation that lets you know what words have been added for clarity. It's not that they're wrong, but then this is a personal thing for me. I like to know that. I like to know that. So literally this is what he says. For this reason the woman ought to have authority on head. Now, the words have been added for clarity is, for this reason the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. And that's what the head covering was to indicate. They didn't have rings, they didn't wear rings like this. But a married woman would cover her head. That indicates she is a married woman. And that was the way it was indicated. That was just part of the culture of the day. And then, where we're going to get stuck for a few minutes, Paul adds 4 words that I've struggled with for so many years. And I'm not saying I've got them all figured out either. I don't have it figured out. Paul simply says, why should a wife have a symbol of authority on her head? He just simply adds, because of the angels. That's all he says. He doesn't define it. He assumes we understand it. Or he assumes that the Corinthians understood it. Now, there's two feasible reasons he said that. The first one, a little bit weak, but some buy into it. And it's the idea that when they would gather for worship in a house somewhere, in a house church, they didn't have buildings, like we do. They met in house churches primarily. But when they met together, there were also unseen guests there as well. Angels. That angels would be present, even though unseen, but out of curiosity would be present to see what God was doing through this different species of creation, humanity, humans. That's one possible interpretation. The second one hails back to Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, where the sons of God see the daughters of men take wives for themselves, and then they produce a hybrid demigod race called the Nephilim. And the word Nephilim literally means giants. Okay? Pre-flood. So that is another possibility. And by the way, that was the dominant view up until the time of Augustine or Saint Augustine. We called Augustine until Dr. Womble corrected us, and he said it's Augustine, not Augustine. Anyway, that's another story. But anyway, so the dominant interpretation, even among Christians, was that this was hailing back to Genesis chapter 6, where these angelic beings left their proper domain. Matter of fact, Peter talks about that in 2 Peter. They left their proper domain and went after strange flesh. They crossed a barrier they were not supposed to cross. They were in rebellion against God in this sense. And they're there in chains because of the rebellion against God in doing such things. Now, there's a lot more can be said about that, but that's the the most probable. And actually, it almost could be both. It could be hailing back to the Genesis 6 event, or it also could mean that there's angelic visitors in worship services just observing what's going on. I don't know that, but that's one of the interpretations. Paul doesn't clarify. Sometimes I wish Paul... Wait a minute, Paul. Can you give me 2 or 3 more verses on what that means? That would help me a lot. Now, is it going to... It doesn't change anything that's absolutely essential by any means. It's just something he says in passing. They must have understood it, or he wouldn't have said it. And they must have understood it, so he does not go into detail to explain it. Because he wasn't really writing with us in mind. He was writing with it for the Corinthians in mind. Okay, I'm parked for a moment if you'd like. And yes?
Were both of those 2 possible meanings, were both of those kind of angels the bad kind?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Not to deviate too far into this, but really I think I'm right here. And it's not because I'm right, because I've been learning from others that support this. I think the spiritual world is far more robust than you and I have ever begun to imagine. When I say more robust, I'm talking about many more creatures, for lack of a better expression, that are inhabiting the spiritual realm that you and I just simply don't see with our eyes. We feel we all sometimes will be impacted with the effects of their actions. We may not see them. And you can appeal to certain kind of glimpses that you are getting from different passages in the Bible. You see it, of course. You see it in Genesis chapter 3. This serpent creature, is it really a serpent? Yeah, but the idea of serpent can mean the shining one. Whatever he looked like, he did not look like a rattlesnake, all right, or a cobra. Something about him. Eve was quite at ease carrying on conversation with this creature. We don't even know who he is until Revelation. Okay? We know him to be Satan because John tells us that in Revelation. That dragon, that serpent, that dragon from the beginning, the devil, Satan, he tells us who he is. He's not identified in Genesis. I didn't know if you were aware of that or not. He wasn't. Then you have the book of Daniel. Daniel introduces us to the Watchers. Talks about them twice. The Watchers. What were we don't find that in the Bible other than there. What is a watcher? Well, they have authority. They have God's authority. They do God's bidding. And then also you have other spirits called princes. There's the prince of Persia. And as Daniel's praying, he's waiting, and then here comes, waiting for the answer. 21 days goes by, no answer, and then Gabriel finally shows up, and he says, sorry, I'm late. That's kind of a loose paraphrase, he didn't say that. I'm late because I had to do battle with the prince of Persia, and I had to get help from your prince, Michael. And so he also says he's going to return. And there's another prince coming, the Prince of Greece. Now, is he talking about Alexander the Great? No, he's not. Because it is a spiritual being that is coming. And what you end up with there, you make some assumptions, but you can't go too far with it. And don't make a big, elaborate doctrine out of it. But the idea is seemingly there that governments, kingdoms, have spirits, for lack of a better expression, that are working in that government. Because you can call them princes or whatever you want to call them, but there seems to be a spiritual entity. Now, that spiritual entity is not concerned about me one bit. But he is concerned about the United States of America. And he's working. And he may have hordes of help working at the highest echelons of government, trying to change, all that. We could go on and on about that. But there seems to be biblical support for that. Again, don't go as like C. Peter Wagner. During the height of his career, C. Peter Wagner was a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he went kind of wackadoodle, talking about the spiritual world. He was what he was doing. He was gathering from allegedly demon-possessed people. He was gathering information from the demonic about this hierarchy in the demonic world, and he had this wrote books about it and all that kind of stuff. Now, for the first problem I have with that, and I read the books because it was kind of the thing at the time, so I wanted to know what's going on. The problem is, how many of you are going to believe what a demon says? I mean, really. Satan himself is called what? He's the father of lies. So I don't think that's a very reliable source. So that's why C. Peter Wagner's books are kind of on my shelf gathering dust. Anyway,
Did
but
you just dismiss that father of lies business and just little tour through what the
I have no idea.
saying?
He one of his major sources of information about the demonic world, the malevolent spirits that are there, came from what he said was from demon-possessed people. So that's why I would say be careful about that. But it does not in any way affect what I just said a moment ago about what Daniel talks about. Okay? All right. Let's go on. But nevertheless, verse 11. Nevertheless, neither is the man independent of the woman, nor the woman independent of the man in the Lord. For as a woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman. But all things are from God. Again, what is he appealing to? Where is Paul's comments and his teaching anchored? Back in Genesis in the creation account, in the events of the creation. That's where he anchors it. Now there's a lesson for you and for me there. When we're talking about things that we believe, our beliefs, what we may teach others, where should it be anchored? In the Scripture. Not in culture, not in trends, not on what's popular today or what's accepted today or what's embraced today, but we need to be anchored in the Scripture. One of the things when it comes to in a doctoral level work, when you get to the dissertation stage, which is the last stage of it, one of the things that you have to do is when you present a proposal for your dissertation, one of your chapters has to be biblical rationale. In other words, it's got to be anchored in the Bible. And it's got to be clear. It can't be just some sort of vague notion in there somewhere. You have to build and you got to have your chair and your vice chair to approve it. Well, you didn't really build a big biblical case here. You need to go back and look at it again. If you want to continue with this particular project, you need to go back and make sure that you have a very clear biblical rationale. Okay? And I would suggest that for us too. When we're talking to people about anything spiritual, that you and I anchor what we say or what we refer to somehow legitimately in what the Bible actually says. And not what we think it says. Or not what we have heard that it says, but what it actually does say. That's what Paul is doing so far in this chapter. He's talking about, what is he talking about? Well, he's talking about worship, the worship service. That's what's going on there. But he's talking about how should this work? How should men and women relate in this kind of environment? In this very holy space? What do you do? Well, women, cover your head. Because in so doing, you're honoring your husband. Men, don't cover your head. Because if you cover your head, and he's even going to talk about it in just a moment, if you cover your head, you're dishonoring Christ. Don't do that. Okay? All right. What else has he got to say about it? Well, he goes on. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? He's already given that the rationale. He's just saying, just think about it for a minute. Judge for yourself. What you understand that, right? Verse 14. Doesn't even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? Years ago, and of course, when I was in elementary school, we're talking about the 70s. Okay, way back. All right. The Gideons at that time in history were, at least at our school, was allowed to come in and give New Testaments to, I think it was a 4th grade class. 5th grade was when 5th grade. But anyway, it's so interesting that because you know what's going on, you know, the long-haired, freaky people, you know. Anyway, one of the Gideons who was passing out Bibles said, "Everyone turn to page such and such." Okay, we did. He said, "Underline this verse."
Oh my goodness.
Guess what verse it was? It was this verse right here. It was this verse right here. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? I think does it say in King James Version a shame? It's a shame upon him. It seems like that's what it said. This is the New King James, by the way, so it's going to be very close. But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her as a covering. And then he says this, a little bit, Bible translators kind of come at it a little bit differently depending on which one you have here. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Some translations will add this idea, we have no other custom. So what he's saying is, this is what I teach all the churches. This is what I teach in all the churches. And in the Greco-Roman world, and remember they live in a culture too, they cut hair. Men cut hair. Men didn't have really, really long hair. I remember you remember Dr. Coble probably. Dr. Coble, he was talking in class that his son had his hair about right down to here. And Dr. Coble said into class, I don't know why we were talking about it. He said he told his son, if you want to have your hair that long, that's fine, but I want you to keep it clean. And then his son said, well, yeah. At the same time, I think he's asking him to borrow a car. He said, but you know, Jesus had long hair. And Dr. Coble responded, and he walked everywhere he went. So I don't know. I don't know. But you can see now how important these kind of relationships are in the life of a biblically New Testament church, a biblical New Testament church. There are certain it is a role that a person plays, or the gifting that they have. It's not that one thing is more valuable than the other. But there is an order to things. And it goes back to creation order. And it's important that we understand that, because we've got to navigate today. And I don't know about poor kids growing up in a confused culture like ours. That, how are they sorting through all this stuff? Or are they sorting through it? Or are they just accepting it? Most will just accept it without giving it any kind of critical thought. And really it is, whether you're talking about your children, your grandchildren, your nieces or nephews, or whomever, you need to be maybe the stalwart person. You're moored in Scripture, and you can see through this stuff. Because it is a direct assault upon basically creation order. And we find that revolt is happening even within churches that claim to be Christian churches. You will find a rebellion against creation order. Because our culture is just in simply abject rebellion against God in every aspect. So what do you expect? What do you expect? Comments or questions? Well, you can see we're not going to make it through the chapter. And really what I'm going to do is, I'm not really going to get into the next segment, because the balance of the chapter is going to be dealing with the Lord's Supper. And that is something that you and I do not want to race through. We want to be able to spend our time literally thinking about and dealing with what he is talking about here. Because it's quite serious. It's not just a ritual. It's far more than that. It's not something we should go through like, okay, I see that we have the elements out again. Let's we want to just get through it so I can get out and we can go eat lunch. We need to be careful, because that is one of the most. It's a very important ordinance within the life of a church, of a people coming together and receiving the elements of the Lord's Supper. And we practice it differently. You might as well face that than they did in the ancient world. And no matter what Christian group you're looking at, we're doing it differently because of certain kind of cultural pressures, and probably for some hygiene issues, and we'll deal with that. But we can still abuse it. We can still abuse the Lord's Supper. Maybe not in the same way that the Corinthians did, because they would do potluck meals too. But they also would have the celebration of the Lord's Supper during one of their potlucks. Now we don't do that. We set the Lord's Supper apart, away from any kind of other meal. But we'll talk about that next time. So again, let me give you the opportunity. Any questions or comments that you might have?